Okay, so we're back for part 2. The type of strategy that you're going to be using for the definition argument is something called criteria match. So let's look at this really simple claim of spanking is or is not child abuse. So we've got these two terms. We have spanking in the X slot and we have child abuse in the Y spot. So in order to craft this definition argument, we're going to have, number one, a definition for child abuse. So, and because you can use sources for the definition argument, you can get that definition from the American Psychological Association or from the Kentucky Child Welfare Department. So there's lots of places where you can find really good specific definitions for child abuse without going to Webster's, right? So dictionary definitions are generally oversimplified and do not carry the nuances that are necessary for definition argument. So the first thing we want to do is establish this definition for child abuse. And if you think in Toulmin terms, that definition for child abuse is going to be your backing. So that means the definition for the Y term is the warrant. So I'll say that again. The definition for the Y term is the warrant. So you're going to have criteria for that Y term. Ideally, you'll have 3 characteristics that define child abuse, and that will be your warrant. Okay, so the definition of the Y is the warrant and backing. So the grounds of the paper then is going to be the discussion of how spanking does or does not fit that criteria. So it makes sense for the definition argument then that your backing and your warrant would come before the reasons and the grounds. So the structure of the definition argument will vary. It will be different from the classical argument because the first thing you want to do for your audience is establish the definition of that Y term. So in this case, that would be a definition of child abuse that had 3 criteria. And then you're going to apply those criteria to spanking to test whether or not spanking does or does not fit the definition for child abuse. So the criteria for child abuse will parallel with the discussion of spanking. So they have to parallel, or maybe they don't parallel. And so that's how you can argue that spanking is not child abuse. So you have to create those criteria. So we might look at the rule of justice here in trying to develop those criteria. So really what we're looking at here is the difference between child abuse and discipline. So spanking is not necessarily a term that can be defined, but it's this idea that spanking functions as discipline. So what's the difference then between discipline and child abuse? So over on the right side, we see that child abuse is emotionally traumatic. It's inconsistent. The child doesn't know what they've done to have this happen to them. So it's kind of an illogical thing. It's very damaging to the relationship between a parent and a child. It can end up with both physical and emotional injury, and it makes the child feel shamed and worthless. So those are my criteria for child abuse. So I might pick to focus on 3 of these. So I might pick, okay, emotionally traumatic, inconsistent, and the injury. So, and then I'm going to look at how discipline is different from that. So instead of being inconsistent, discipline is very consistent. So a child knows there are rules and guidelines and expectations, and the child knows and is aware of what these are. And the child also knows and is aware that there are disciplinary measures that come along with the failure to meet those. And so this idea of consistent consequences is a criterion for discipline. We know that as a form of discipline, spanking is used as the very last step. So there are other things that are employed before that. If used correctly and consistently, spanking could strengthen the relationship with a parent, and it could empower the child because the child knows, okay, if I don't do these particular things, then I'm not going to receive this disciplinary measure. So we establish the criteria, and then we show how our X term does or does not fit that criteria. And we see here the rule of justice. We see how spanking is used as a last resort when it's a discipline, but it's used as a first resort when it is child abuse. So we're beginning to see this differentiation between the two ideas. So I said earlier where you could maybe find some definitions of spanking. And I said other than Webster's. So typically the Webster's definitions are very black and white. And for a definition argument, we're very much interested in the idea of nuance and shades of gray. There are lots of authoritative dictionaries. There are law dictionaries. A really good one is Black's Law Dictionary. So if you're doing, and there will be a definition of child abuse in there too, except it will be a legal definition. So there's tons of great places to find definitions without immediately resorting to a straight dictionary. So the rest of this slideshow is mainly just examples of claims that you can use. I would prefer that you not use the spanking example because we went through that so specifically, but there's lots of examples here. There's some environmental topics, and like you can move different companies in and out. So if you don't want to write about Coca-Cola's plastic use, you could write about, something that Nike does or, whatever company. So these are just kind of templates, and then you can plug different things in. Remember that the underlying structure of the definition argument is X is or is not Y. So you have to be arguing for what something is or assigning it to a category. So here's some other choices that you could use. So that's all for this particular slideshow. I do have a second slideshow that I wanted to go over. So let's go ahead and look at that too in this video. So we're looking back at this idea of criteria match, and this is just a restatement of what I said just a little bit ago. In the warrant and backing is where you're going to define that Y term, whatever it is. That's where you're going to create your criteria. In the grounds and with the reasons, you're going to parallel that criteria and try to create your match. Or if you're doing a is not, you're going to try to show how they're different. Okay. My advice is to do the warrant and backing first, because that's where you're going to establish your criteria. So here's a couple more ideas. So if we're doing cohabitating is marriage, then we're going to define marriage. So what are 3 characteristics for marriage? And then we're going to show, in this case, how those would be similar to cohabitating. The next one has been a pretty popular claim. A biological parent is not always a parent. So for this one, you would define parent, giving 3 criteria, and you would show how not every biological parent has those characteristics. Burning the American flag is not free speech. This one is really interesting because we actually have the First Amendment, which gives us the criterion for free speech. So you could go to that amendment and you could pick your characteristics from that in order to argue whether or not burning the flag matches with that free speech. So here's a couple more ideas. So graphic novels are serious literature. Racial profiling is a civil rights violation. So some of these, like civil rights violation and hate crime, there are going to be legal definitions for those. So that will make your process a little bit easier, I think. Again, because you'll be able to establish the criterion based on that researched definition. And so here's a couple more. So let's talk about research a little bit. There's a research folder and there's a My Writing Lab research basics that you need to go through. But you want to make sure that you're citing all borrowed material with in-text citations and a citation on the Works Cited page. No Wikipedia, no religious or political propaganda. It's awesome if you can use the LRC databases. Remember that summary, paraphrase, and direct quotations require in-text documentation. So this is what it would look like. So here's an attributive tag according to Thomas Jones, and then the quote begins, "The final frontier, blah, blah, blah." And then here's page 72. So I know that based on the information I'm given in the text, that when I get to the Works Cited page, there's going to be an entry that begins Jones, comma, Thomas, period. Then I'm going to get all of the publication information after that. Below that is an example, of using the last name and the page number in the parenthetical citation. So here we don't have an attributive tag that uses the author. As we begin to examine the literature of young writers, we must keep in mind, and then here comes the quote, "The final frontier of literature is the recognition of lost genres." So in this case, we don't have the author's name in the attributive tag. So we want to put that down at the end in the citation. So just a quick little overview of using MLA. As always, you can research. You can reach out to me with an email or a phone call or an office visit on Monday or Tuesdays, and I can help you with that in your paper.